Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, organisation development has often been accused of being too theoretical. So, we invited Sarah Walsh, who takes a refreshingly practical approach to the profession. She emphasised the importance of meeting people where they are and helping to get them to get to where they need to be. She has a huge focus on uniting research and OD practice. Now, Sarah's very kindly joined us. She's been away travelling in, is it Costa Rica and Canada, Sarah?
It is indeed, yes, it is.
So we're very appreciative, but there might be a slight delay due to jet lag on some of these questions. But we'll edit all this out. But thank you so much for joining us. So, and we really appreciate you making time for this. So just a little bit about Sarah. So she's an organisation development consultant, and she's currently supporting a number of organisations through fixed-term contracts, which is a really fascinating way of doing OD. She's currently organisational development consultant of the Academy of Medical Sciences, and before that, she was lead performance consultant at Essex County Council. She's been change and continuous improvement manager at City University of London, and her experience is backed by lots of professional and academic qualifications. And she's been on the really interesting masters in organizational behavior and business psychology from Birkbeck. She's got a postgraduate certificate in transformative coaching, and she's also done the Roffey Park OD practitioner program, which Danny, you've done as well, haven't you?
I've done it as well, yeah, not at the same time as Sarah, but we've done that.
So we've got Roffey Park alumni here, and she has a whole host of certifications in change management and is certified to deliver a whole range of psychometric surveys. She's also a workplace and career coach, and in amongst that, she still has spare time, but gives her time freely to research and campaign and volunteer for the local citizens' advice, and there's a huge need for that right now. She's also a tutor, and she works with students studying history and psychology, and has been doing this for 10 years. And part of her reason for visiting Costa Rica is she's an animal lover, and you have, is it 8 pets? Is that right, Sarah?
9.
Every
time I talk to people, it increases.
Okay, we'll find
You didn't
out
sneak
more.
something back from Costa Rica, did you?
I did not.
Snuck in a sloth or something.
I can assure you not.
Brilliant. Well, welcome, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. And next time I have an interview, do you think you can join me? Because that was an excellent summary. Thank you, Gary.
You're very welcome. We can be hired by the hour for that. That's great.
Brilliant. Oh, it's lovely to have you, Sarah. So just an easy question to start off. Just tell us a bit about your role. What does it involve?
So, well, as Gary mentioned, I sort of opt for fixed term contracts. So my role, even though it has different titles, it is essentially an organizational development practitioner. And it is so varied, as you can imagine. I'm sure people listening will agree it can be a very varied role. So I could be doing anything from employee engagement workshops, discovery projects, trying to understand what's happening in an organization to help leaders, managers, whoever it is, get the insights that they need to create change strategies and action plans. And even the day-to-day can be very different, but even the contract can be very different because it very much depends on the context of the organisation and what they're asking for. So I've done OrgDev projects within the context of restructures against the backdrop of really tough savings targets. But I've also had the pleasure of working with organisations where the context is very different, and it's a case of we've got money to spend and we're looking to grow, but sustainably. How do we do that? And then that's without even talking about how to do org development in a pandemic, which was kind of like a petri dish of experimentation and really putting our practice and research to the test. So, yeah, I guess in a nutshell, it can be really very varied. I'm sure we'll get into some of the tasks and what that can mean on a day-to-day. But even within the practice, it can be very dependent on the context you're operating within as well, which I guess makes it all the much more fun and the challenge. And I guess that's what we're looking for as practitioners.
It's often about the challenge, isn't it, and the variety. Yeah. So what are you working on now in the role you're in currently? What's the focus of that one?
Well, this is the one where they've gone through a period of rapid growth, which is really great. So they've gone from a small organisation to a medium-sized organisation, and doing so since the pandemic. And it's been a case of, where do we begin with this? There's some practices that we know we need to improve upon. There are some gaps that we know we need to build upon, but how do we do so sustainably? How do we get to the next stage of growth, but doing it in a way that isn't going to overstretch us or create change too quickly? Basically, yeah, how do you get to that next stage of growth? How do you do it in a sustainable way? And what would that direction of travel look like?
And the other thing you talked about, you talked about volunteering being really important. We did that in the intro. What is it about volunteering? Why is that so important to you?
Yeah, it's very important to me. I've been volunteering now in different guises for the length of my career. It's important that I'm making that contribution. There's certain passion causes of mine that I feel really strongly about, housing being one of them, social justice being another. Actually, before I got into organisational development, I was in homelessness prevention and social care. It's been quite a varied career even before I got into organisational development. And the volunteer sector, they need volunteers to keep going. And another big passion of mine is research, not just in terms of academic research, but in terms of engagement, community engagement, and taking that research and creating something meaningful, and hopefully that leading to us being able to create meaningful change nationally by looking at what's happening locally and hoping it can make a bigger difference.
Brilliant. And we always ask this question because it's so fascinating. We've never had the same story twice. But what was your journey into OD? Did it find you, or did you find it? Like, what happened?
Yeah, it definitely found me. And actually, now I'm further ahead in my career and I look at the qualifications available for organisational development. I wonder how people, because I know it's a very common theme that people stumble into organisational development. And actually, when I think about my network, I don't think I've met anyone that knew what they were looking for and went straight into the field. Actually, I might be wrong, but I can't recall many people saying that to me. So yeah, it definitely found me. So like I said, I had quite a varied career. I was definitely trying to find what it was I wanted to do. And I did finance for a little while, which for people who know me will know that is hilarious because numbers are not my thing. So that didn't last long. Like I said, housing, homelessness is a real area of passion for me. So I went into social housing for a little while. So much respect for frontline workers. I couldn't do it. And so I sort of thought, okay, should I do something that's still within the field, but not necessarily that particular area? So I went into Essex County Council and I went into project management and continuous improvement. And at the time that I joined as a business analyst, they were in a period of redesign. And I was working within their people and transformation function. And my manager at the time said, actually, we think you'd be really at home with organisational development. Cut to the question everyone asks, what is organisational development? What is that? And I think that was my first experience. And it was in the context of doing organisational design, moved formally into organisational development. And that's when I did my OD practitioner course at Roffey Park. And then ever since then, I've just, that's where I've found my home. I always say that I feel really lucky to have found a job that feels more like a hobby. And I've just been really fortunate to have kept within the field, expanding my practice, gaining new experiences. That's kind of why I do fixed term contracts. I like to experience lots of different contexts and organisations. But yes, it definitely found me.
It's interesting because they found they identified something in you. What do you think it is what they identified in you that thought she'd be a great fit for OD?
I think I get this feedback quite a lot, actually. I think it's because I love the academic side. I love reading a journal, but I also really love being able to translate it into something meaningful. I like both sides of things. I love working with people. I like making connections with people. I like problem solving. And that's not me saying I have an answer. I like exploring what it could be and having that curiosity around what's your experience of this challenge? What can we do? I really enjoy that side of things. And the other thing that I've come to realize, and I don't know if this was true for this person who identified it in me at the time, but it's something I get a lot now, it's patterns and being able to see the cause and effect and think, okay, well, if this is happening here, what does it mean for over here? What does that mean for what we have to do and the right sequence, and not necessarily rushing to things just so that we can be seen to do something, really going up and thinking, what is the pattern here? And also, and I say this with a smile because sometimes it goes down well, sometimes not so much. I do just really like to be that person who asks potentially awkward questions that person who can sort of say, oh, we're doing this. Last week you said this. Is this the right course of action? And really being able to ask what they call courageous questions. I guess it's that term that people call themselves, and I don't know if I feel comfortable saying that I identify as this, but that disruptor. I'm not sure I'm as bold as some of the practitioners I know who identify as disruptors, but definitely like to be that person that pokes you and says, yeah, this might need some attention.
And how did having a grounding in sort of project management inform your practice since then? Because that's quite a good discipline to have, isn't it?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, actually, because project management is one of those disciplines where I think it's good to have both sides. It provides, when you're a practitioner, I find it provides assurance for people who are looking to you to provide direction of travel and some assurances. So I think having that project management side is good for that. I think there's a lot of methodologies that have certainly helped me in terms of, okay, I've got all of this information. What do I now do with it? The sequencing. I'm not a planner. Once again, people that know me well will chuckle at that because I'm not a planner. But what I think the project management side has given me is that sense of, okay, what's the sequence here? What needs to happen and at what point? And giving that sense of direction.
Obviously, you invested in a master's in organizational behaviour and business psychology. When did you decide that you wanted to sort of commit all that time to it? And what kind of things did you take away from it?
Yeah, well, I think I got to, what year would it have been? 2018, I believe it was. And I remember feeling a bit more established in the role, and I'd done a few courses that had helped hone my practitioner skills. And I was working as a practitioner in the field and had been for a few years. And I just started to notice a lot of fellow practitioners having this qualification. And that was probably the first thing that sparked my interest. And I've got a lot of, role models in the field who had masters, and I'd spoken to them. And I think for me, what I was looking for at the time was, I am a keen reader. I read a lot of stuff, but I needed a bit of structure to help paint the picture and position that research within the context of the field. And that's where I thought, well, actually, the masters would probably be a really great opportunity for me to get that bigger picture and to fill some of the gaps and help me understand where would my development be. In terms of what I took from it, I actually wrote a blog on LinkedIn about my findings when I did qualify, which would have been in 2021, I believe. It was across the pandemic.
Oh,
and
our research only went back to 2022. We missed it.
But yeah, I can summarize it in 2 words.
Please.
It depends. That every single question I asked, Birkbeck alumni potentially watching this, my lecturers, you'll all know, you said it to me, it depends, which I thought was really good, actually. At the time, there were a lot of us that were thinking there wasn't an answer. Like, what do you mean? But actually, it fits perfectly because so much is based on context. If I think back to some of the leadership development modules and readings we were doing, this idea that there isn't a perfect leader, and it's just as much about followership as it is the leader anyway. And reading case studies where you would have this incredible leader, transformational leadership, can craft a vision, take people on board with them, absolutely brilliant, put them in a completely different organization, they flounder because they don't adapt, they don't see that context. And so for me, actually hearing that there isn't an answer, it very much depends on context, was really comforting, because then that meant that as practitioners, we have the space to explore, the space to contribute, and the space to learn. And I think that's really where the bridge between research and practice is, being able to see that actually there aren't all these answers, and there never will be, and that's fine, because we can work together on finding what works.
It's not always what our clients or our stakeholders want to hear, because they often want certainty. So how do you kind of manage that tension with the people you're working with?
So this is where I think the pandemic has really helped, because I think even though it has prompted many individuals to feel like they need to have an answer to provide that assurance, I think one of the things that I always keep close to my mind is there's something really weird that happens when we cross the work boundary. and I mean that in terms of the home office, not necessarily walking into a building, where we go from adult to parent and child. And, you know, you think about everything that's happening in the world at the moment that's causing uncertainty, which can cause a lot of discomfort, to say the least. And I think there's a lot of individuals where, you know, they're well-intentioned, they want to provide some certainty. But the reality is that there's a lot of stuff that we can't. And so one of the things that I always do as a practitioner, from even beyond I start a contract, is I will be really upfront in contracting throughout and say, if I don't know the answer to something, I will tell you, and I will try to build credibility in that way. But what I can give you and what I can assure you on is that I've got an evidence base that I can lean from, a network that is very generous, as I'm sure you're both aware, and I have that I can draw from. I've got discovery tools I can use, hypotheses I can form, and I can tell you what I think might work, and we can go on that journey together to see what does and doesn't work. And a lot of the time, organizations have history that they can learn from, what has worked previously, what hasn't worked. So I think there is something about being upfront, honest, building that credibility, but also being able to provide assurance that whatever we will do, we will learn from, and that will have utility in itself. And I think this is where coaching, especially leadership coaching, team coaching, can be a really useful intervention, because a lot of the time there is something deeper beyond that need for providing certainty and having certainty that can be useful exploring as well.
Yeah, and I guess when you do that, there's a risk, isn't there? Because it might be that they actually do want to pay for that kind of certainty, whereas really what you're trying to get them is a much deeper fix as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is where, you know, the field of organizational development, you know, management consulting is so varied, because that's my brand of practitioner. And don't get me wrong, there are certain things where I can feel more confident and certain about, but, you know, there's some really big organizational questions that are happening everywhere, so many tensions in organizations, that actually there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's about managing those tensions to best effect. You know, so a really live example for me at the moment is this tension around, should we be making interview questions public before an interview process? You know, and this is one example of many which demonstrates that the power has shifted from the organisation to the employee. This idea that we bring our whole selves to work, which can be quite unsettling. And if we stick with that particular example, there's a lot of people that will say, well, hang on a second, that means you can cheat. That means you're not going to give your most authentic answer. And then you've got other groups of individuals where potentially the old way of working, it's not really that old, or traditional way of thinking about work, that's always worked well for them. And so it creates a tension. What do you do then? Because it can often look like you're taking sides, when really it's about, okay, how do we manage that tension? So that's how I sort of sell myself as a consultant. I'm aware of these bigger paradigm shifts and how the practice of OD can help. And, you know, to be really honest, I'm a bit suspicious of anyone who can come in and say this is going to work for you. That would make me very nervous as a practitioner, because automatically I'm taking responsibility for something I don't necessarily have a lot of control over. All I can do is influence.
Yeah, and I guess, look, because one of the things we're always really interested in these conversations is like, how do we start? And one of the beauties of like fixed term contract working is it's just like, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And part of it is helping organizations commission work better. So what can organizations do to commission work better, to be really clear, this is what we want, or let's work out something with you? What does good commissioning look like to you when you begin a new role?
It depends.
That's okay. That's a good answer.
See what I mean? It's just the best answer. But yeah, it genuinely does depend, because I've had contracts where they have sensed that organizational development as a practice can help them, but have actually kept the agenda quite loose and have given me a lot of freedom and flexibility to sort of say, okay, we know, we have a sense that there's something here. We have a sense that we've got a problem here. We know that because we're having retention issues, or we're getting a lot of complaints, well-being is becoming an issue. So they'll have a sense of what the issue is, but not necessarily a way forward. And they'll give me a lot of flexibility to shape that work. And actually, another thing that's really important when you grant that flexibility is access as well. Access to speak to people, access to ask the questions that you think are going to help, and really surfacing any agendas that there might be. So I've actually sometimes, when it comes to commission work, found it really helpful to have it be quite a loose agenda and freedom. But on the other hand, I've also, when the agenda is a bit more clear in terms of we know we need to come to this outcome and this is what we need to achieve by this point, having that transparency from the outset and those boundaries, contracting around those boundaries is incredibly important. So once again, that context and the agenda is really important for those boundaries, because then that gives me the permission, I guess, for lack of a better word, to be able to say, okay, this is what I think is needed. What do you think? And to be able to have that. It's like the point that you made, the ABC, always be contracting, always have that really clear from the start, and having that conversation really transparent is really helpful for me.
So what do you enjoy most about OD?
My gosh, the variety. I like that even though I'll be working on different contracts, I've done, I've set out employee forums in lots of different organizations, and it is different every single time. I've done leadership development programs in different organizations, and it's different every time. So you're always learning, even though sometimes you can feel like you're doing the same thing. You're always learning. And actually, even when I speak to internal consultants that have been in the same organization for a long time, that's still what they say to me, because people change, environments change, pandemics happen, AI comes along. There's always going to be those challenges that are going to keep things interesting. So I love the variety, and I love the depth and breadth in terms of, when people ask me, what does development look like for you? There's so many different avenues that I could choose to specialize in if I so chose to do so. I could go down the really academic route. I could specialize in group dynamics. I can go and be a consultant. I can specialize in Gestalt. I could be here all day talking about all the different avenues. So there's so much variety on so many different levels. And I love working with people, and I love problem solving. And I think for me, we spend so much time at work. I was reading a research paper actually for my postgrad certificate in coaching psychology, and it was talking about what work does for us. And it's, for some people, it's a very transactional relationship. I go and I get paid. That's brilliant. But for a lot of people, it forms such a big part of their identity. And there's always a lot of role conflict for a lot of individuals. That question of, well, if I'm going to spend time working versus caring for this individual, or going to Costa Rica and Canada, then it's got to be fulfilling. It's got to be satisfying. And I just think at the moment, there's a lot to have fun with. It's challenging, but there's a lot to be playful around and have fun with.
And then on the flip side, what do you find most challenging about working in OD?
Yeah, what do I find most challenging? I think sometimes I'll be working in org development teams, but sometimes it is just me. And sometimes I will feel the responsibility of that. And inevitably, there'll be moments where I'll make a recommendation. And even though my mindset will be very much, this is the evidence I'm acting upon, this is the hypothesis I'm taking forward, and this is the intervention we're going to experiment with, then, is this definitely the right path? So there's that sense of responsibility that can sometimes come with that. I think sometimes it can be quite hard to rise up if you're working in one particular organization versus working as an external with multiple. And sometimes you have to really be intentional about rising above the detail of that organization and connecting it up to the wider picture. There's a lot of things that are happening in organizations I'm working with that are big paradigm shifts. The return to the office, for example, and how you tackle that. Leadership practices becoming more sustainable, managing this shift of power and the tensions in organizations. So I think sometimes, connecting what you're working with those wider shifts can sometimes be challenging. And actually, sometimes, like I say, the variety is really great, there's lots of things to work on and develop in, but sometimes that can be quite overwhelming, especially when you're like me and you're interested in everything. Like you say, I do a bit of tutoring. I like to volunteer, and I really love what I do. And you know, sometimes I can look at the field and think, oh my gosh, I love group dynamics, and you know, team coaching is on the rise, so I'm going to do that. And then I'll read something else about, you know, one of my things at the moment is this idea of Gestalt OD practice, which looks at, you know, thinking it, you know, psychodynamic OD practices are looking at the past and how those unconscious dynamics show up in your teams. I'm interested in Gestalt now and the present and the future, but I can't do it all at once. So yeah, sometimes I wish I had one of those time machines where I could do it all.
And thinking about that, obviously, like change has been a sort of a thread throughout your career, like from university life to working in Essex Council to working on your different contracts as well. Change isn't for the faint of heart, is it? And there's often moments in the change process, and it's often just before the tipping point reaches where it can often feel quite dark, can't it? Because it's almost like you're pushing and you want to wait for the moment to happen. What have been some of your most impactful moments or biggest sort of learning experiences when you've been sort of either driving change or part of a change team that really stand out for you?
I think when I first started in change, a lot of the research or practices I was exposed to were very much on the change is linear. You can come up with a plan, and if you tell people what the change is, they can either get on the bus or off the bus. And then once those that remain on the bus stay on the bus, you can take them through a plan, tell them what to do, and they'll do it. And obviously that probably only lasted as something I was subscribed to for a very short period of time, because change is messy, life is messy. It doesn't make sense to have such a linear approach to change. It's much more complex, it's much more emergent. And I think one of the things that really sticks with me, and I often feel like a bit of a fraud when I say, is there's so much about change that is about conversations and sense making and finding and holding and facilitating the space for people to make sense of what is happening. Once again, this is where coaching can be really helpful, but just embracing the fact that my role is to find those spaces and to hold it and to help that sense making process happen, rather than going down a traditional business change route, which is very much, can you come up with a plan and tell us what we need to do? And I have, when I say that to people, other practitioners and people that I work with, this idea of embracing that change is messy, they always say to me, that makes sense, but also that the weight is lifted off their shoulders. They don't feel this pressure to force change through, because I haven't found much, if any, research where change happens like that, unless it's a very straightforward, everyone subscribes to it. You know, organizations don't work like that. So that's my biggest insight, and that's the biggest insight I pay forward when people ask me, because it seems to be the one that resonates the most.
Yeah, and so many of the change models make it look really simple and linear, and there's kind of these nice steps that you go through, and you know, they don't reflect the messiness and the reality of change in organizations when people are involved, do they?
No, and this is where I sometimes feel a bit of an anomaly, though, because I appreciate the models. I really like the simplicity of them, and I actually do. I'm about to completely contradict myself here. I do see the utility of them in providing a foundation to, I guess, introduce concepts. Because if I take, for example, ADKAR as a change model, so, you know, awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, reinforcement. Now, on paper, even though it looks like a circle, it looks very simple, it oversimplifies. However, there is evidence behind it, practitioner evidence. I haven't read enough about the academic side to know about that. But even though change is much messier than that, there's a lot of utility in terms of being able to take people through that and being able to introduce some of the concepts that they might see appear when we go through a change project. So even saying change project actually made me shudder a little bit. So I'm in no way against models. I think they have utility. They're just not the be all and end all, and they need to be married up with that practitioner experience and, I guess, held loosely, and not held too tight.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking the same thing as you were talking. It's hold them lightly and use them where they're helpful. Don't follow them slavishly.
Yeah,
So,
and we had David Wilkinson on recently, didn't we? And he, from the Oxford Review, and he was sort of describing models are really useful, but they're kind of like maps. And maps are a way of seeing things, but they're not the only way of seeing things. And you kind of sort of hold it appropriately to help let it guide you, but you still need to use other things like intuition and that, don't you?
Well, yeah, because the thing is, imagine a world where we got rid of models. It would just be chaotic. You know, there is a reason we have models, maps, frameworks, and you see it on LinkedIn a lot, don't you? You see these posts where, you know, because I do this a lot, and I'll put frameworks out. I'm a massive fan of Birkbeck, for example, as a map of an organisation, because what I like about it is, yes, it's very 2D on a piece of paper. I'm very old school. I've got a piece of paper apparently, but I like using it as a checklist to just make sure, okay, are all my plates in balance here? What is not quite in tandem? What have I not paid enough attention to? And I use it. I really like it as a tool to introduce OD to organisations. But I know that sometimes when I post these frameworks, some individuals will say, well, it's much more complicated than that. And it's a case of, yes, I know. However, if we didn't have something, what would we have? We would just have lots of conversations. That doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes people need that assurance. One of the biggest bits of advice, actually, that I received when I was at Roffey Park, I had the privilege of doing a dialogic OD course with Bob Marshak and Jervis Bush, I think it is. Yes, very, very privileged. And it was talking about emergent change, and it was absolutely brilliant. And I really enjoyed it. And me being me, I think at the time I was in a role where I just knew they weren't going to take to these concepts, and I could bring them in and not use the terms to help, but they wanted a change plan. So I asked the question of my fellow practitioners in the course, and I said, look, my team need a change plan, and what are your thoughts on this, bearing in mind this is emergent change we're talking about? And they said, if your organisation needs a change plan, do a change plan. Doesn't mean you're going to stick to it, because they're not looking for something to hold you to account to. They're looking for an element of assurance. Kind of goes back to your question, Gary and Danny, around how do I provide certainty? Sometimes it's doing those practices, using those models. Doesn't mean you're necessarily going to follow them step by step. So yeah, you can see I feel quite passionately about this.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to what we said at the beginning about your take on kind of meeting people where they are. So it's really important, isn't it, that, you know, we meet people where they are and we give them solutions and ideas they can work with that aren't kind of overly academic or out of their sphere of understanding.
Exactly. And I think sometimes I read research and I think, oh, this is brilliant. This is how organizations should run. And then I go into a coaching situation or I go into a contract, and there is absolutely no way that I would be able to introduce those concepts. So I have to practice a bit of reflexivity, a bit of judgment in terms of, you know, how far do I take them? And I think this is a bit of a debate that I notice when I engage in OD networks and conferences. I can absolutely hold my own with, if we stick with the dialogic OD example, and I can understand the concepts and I can talk about them. But I'm also really aware that if I pitch myself as a practitioner where that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to say this is what the world of work looks like, a 4-day week, AI being used everywhere, really clear strategy, and you're going to hold yourselves to account. It's going to be wonderful. I can absolutely do that. But if you're miles away, one of my core principles as a practitioner is that I should always be shoulder to shoulder with you. And so it's a dose of judgment as to how far you push them, but I will always meet them where they are. And that's my starting point. And that is exactly why every project will be different, every program will be different, because their starting position will be different.
The other thing I was going to ask you, so leaders have got an increasingly difficult job when I look at the kind of role that a leader or a manager is expected to take. How can OD help leaders kind of make sense of their roles and be more effective in them?
Well, I think this is going to be an enduring question. And to be honest, I think it probably always has been for organizational development. It's just the landscape has shifted into something that feels much more complex. So I think for me, So I'm going to start it with my definition of org development, if that's okay, and then come back to the question. And please remind me of the question if I totally go off on the tangent. But for me, org development is aligning strategy with your culture, with your practices, and doing it in a way that is participatory and using an evidence base and behavioural sciences. So for me, one of the big things for leaders is trying to make sure that they take accountability for all of those areas as best that they can. And I think OD can be a really great mirror and reminder for making sure that all of those different areas get the attention that they deserve. I think the other thing as well with practitioners, and once again, this is surfacing another principle of mine, is, and I do think this is probably one of the competencies, if we were to say have a competencies framework for OD. I'm awaiting comments about suggesting an OD framework. But having that external insight and being able to bring that into the work and being able to say, okay, as a leader, these are the leadership challenges. This is what's going to be coming up ahead for you. Let's see how we can prepare for that. But I think one of the biggest things that I find I'm working with the most and thinking about how OD can help is sustainability around leadership. So you've got some really big challenges coming up ahead, some really big ethical challenges as well, if we think about artificial intelligence and how we introduce that. But there are so many opportunities for change and so many well-intentioned leaders and managers wanting to say yes to everything because everything feels strategically important. And I think the role of OD is being able to have conversations around where does your focus need to be? What would a more sustainable way of working look like? Where do we need to place our strategic focus? And once again, I was reading a really great book. It was a really long flight back from Costa Rica, and it was talking about senior leadership teams and the end of the heroic chief exec, the rise of leadership teams and being able to build that leadership capacity much further. So we move away from that command and control way of thinking. And, it's in those sorts of spaces, when I think about the rise of team coaching as well, it's in all of those different areas that I think OD can really help and provide some space for thinking and sense making again and really thinking about where does our strategic focus need to be.
Because when you're in the room where they're trying to prioritize, whether you're in the strategy room or a leadership team meeting and they're trying to agree priorities, we kind of call it the groan zone because it's the bit where they've got to stay with it and it gets really difficult. And particularly if you're, one of the things about heroic leadership is that someone else decides the priorities for you and they carry the responsibility and they carry the anxiety. But when you're in a leadership team meeting and, if you're a functional setup, then you've got to make sacrifices. You've got to live with the anxiety of choosing one option over the other. You've got to give an account for it. And that's often why organizations have so many priorities, because they can't stay with it. What can be done for leaders to kind of work through that?
Yeah, well, this is where I think before you even get into the conversation about strategic priorities, it's worth taking a step back and almost assessing where you are as a team. If you're in an organization, because once again, context is important, it depends. There are some organizations where actually having that one chief exec is most helpful because, I don't know, either your business is so dispersed that actually it's so dispersed you don't need to come together as a leadership team. But that for those businesses where your services are very interdependent and you do need a leadership team, I think before you're even getting into the conversation about strategic priorities, it's about looking at where are we as a leadership team for exactly the point that you've mentioned, Garin. You've got personal agendas. You've got individuals who have got to the table through having those individual accountabilities. It's really hard. We're all humans. It's really hard to have built a service only to then be sat in a room and have to maybe make sacrifices for the greater good. It's a really difficult conversation. So where I found it to be really helpful, and this takes time, and I think this is one of the problems. No one has time, but I think it pays dividends to just take a step back and go, how do we want to do this? Where are we as a team? Do we know each other's preferences? Do we have psychological safety to be able to say, actually, I don't want to give this up, or actually, I think this is the right thing to do? Do you have the space to challenge? you know, and if I think about some of the time that is spent having strategic conversations, actually that time could have been spent having those sorts of conversations. And I think part of the problem can be is that they can look a bit fluffy. And if you're in a time pressured environment, they look like a luxury. But there's so much utility to just contracting around how are we going to have this conversation, you know, proactively thinking about what's going to derail us and planning for that. I think that there's so much utility to having that conversation. And it can be a workshop, it can be a one-off, it can be a program of team coaching if it needs to be. But just assessing where you are now, I think it pays dividends in my experience.
Fabulous. So when you think about success, how do you measure success when you're working in OD?
Yeah, that is a really tricky one, because I think where you're sometimes working across a system, across an organization, even if you're working at multiple levels, either one-to-one, team level, organization wide, it can sometimes be really hard to then make a connection, a cause and effect. I did this and this happened. So I'm not going to sit here and talk about, oh, I did this intervention and staff retention, you know, was really good afterwards. I think everyone can Google the staff metrics you can use. I think for me, it's much more intuitive than that. It's the feedback I'm getting. It's that sense of positivity and are we going in the right direction of travel? Sometimes that can be enough for me. And it's very individual to the organisation. So to give you some really tangible examples, there's things that I've been able to support implement that have been tried multiple times before, but this is the time where it's actually happened because we've done it in the right sequence, or we focused on putting the right conditions in place first. And that to me is a success because we've actually been able to do it this time. So that suggests to me that something's gone right. But sometimes it's feedback. I've worked with leaders who are up all night worried about, you know, how do I do this? How do I do that? One of my metrics is they're starting to sleep again. And that's, you know, that's not necessarily down to me, but that is down to them either having the space to work problems through, having that coaching space, just having that sense of a direction and a roadmap and a sense of actually there is a way forward. And don't get me wrong, sometimes the metrics are very, very even more tangible than that. You know, I have this deadline and I need this structure in place by then. Being able to achieve that and being able to do so with people saying, actually, the change was managed really well there. I felt I had a say and I have a belief in this leadership team. So my metrics and my success measures will be very much dependent on the context. And I guess for me, I judge it in the contracting stage. What would success look like for you? Let's partner around what that looks like so that, you know, we can manage expectations and build on this together.
And what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned along the way?
One of the biggest lessons, so I'm going to interpret that question actually as what would I say to myself if I was starting again?
Maybe we should change that question.
That's a really good question. Yeah.
Well, only because one of the first things that came to mind was about language and semantics. And I think when I first came into this field, I really latched on to am I really doing OD? What am I doing now? Does this count as OD? Because when I first got into the field and I, you know, was learning about it and I was meeting practitioners, you know, there are spaces in the field where I would say there can be some snobbery around what counts as OD. And I think when I was early on in my career, I really took that and internalized that. And that translated into me thinking, you know, am I really doing OD? Does this count? And I think for me, as I broadened my network, met different practitioners, explored different avenues of org development, academic, practitioner-based, but like I say, in the different fields, I sort of lost my connection to, am I doing it right? Because, you know, like most things, there's not a clear definition anyway. If you go on CIPD, you'll find a different definition compared to if you go to Roffey Park. And yes, there's common concepts, you know, all of them look at strategy, all of them look at participative change. But the field is so broad and it evolves. And also, who's going to tell you whether you are doing OD or not? There's no higher being that says, yeah, no, you're doing it now, Sarah. So I decided to just let go of it. And that was one of my biggest lessons. And one of the things that felt more helpful to me, instead of being so binary in my thinking, was to learn as much as I could about the field and come up with my own principles. I'm always thinking about how my knowledge as a practitioner, how I behave as a practitioner, how I'm doing as a practitioner, all of those different areas. I try to do supervision to really reflect on my practice, how much of this is me. When I'm giving feedback to leaders, how much is this informed by my feeling of what they should do versus what I'm really seeing? And I think that is probably one of the biggest lessons, not holding the field so tightly, but navigating my principles and what it means for me. And once again, the pressure just lifts. And I just think it makes it a better experience for your clients as well, to be honest. Because the other thing as well with your finding your principles is you find your brand and your area. I know there'll be practitioners in the field, some of whom are really good friends of mine. We have completely different views. If you had both of us in an organisation, you'd get a completely different experience. It's neither here nor there. So I think, loosening that grip was really helpful to me.
You obviously do lots of learning and development yourself. How are you investing in your own learning and development at the moment? What's on your list?
Yes, well, I'm really fascinated by this concept of an evidence base and just really aware of how much we read in research where actually there isn't an evidence base because there's no central definition to link it back to. So I'm very interested in learning more about how do we form that evidence base? How do we bring it together? And like I said, I've got a real interest in groups and teams. And I feel a lot of my qualifications centre on one-to-one interventions, coaching, for example, and coaching psychology. And I really think organisations are made up of teams. And I often find when I look at articles or change plans or things like that, they can often look at individual level interventions and org-wide. And actually, there's teams everywhere. So I think that's going to be my next area of curiosity. But one of the things I found really helpful in terms of just coming up, because the field is so broad, how do you identify? Obviously following your interest and your gut, but there is an app that I use, and I think it's on the equality and diversity. I cannot think what the website is called. That's really annoying for the sake of this podcast. But there is an app where it talks about the different skills that you have as a practitioner, the different areas of knowledge, and it just allows you to test where you are in each area, and it just inspires thinking. And I found that a really helpful tool for navigating.
Is this Mian Chun Judges? Yes.
Thank you for understanding my gibberish.
No, not at all.
Exactly
she runs a really good. She's obviously passed away, unfortunately. Yes. So before her legacy was that she left a brilliant YouTube channel full of like experts, wasn't it? From the legends of OD, she brought them together. And one of the last things she did as well was to put together this amazing app, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it is a brilliant app. And actually, just watching those webinars, that series, because I think it came out over the pandemic and we obviously had a lot of time to watch things. That's another way that I look at different things and I think, would I be interested in that? Is there a utility for me in this? And development for me doesn't have to be a qualification. It can just be reading up on things, talking to people. And I think that's where my interest peaked in group dynamics and thinking about team level interventions. But they're a great series, and there's a really great one actually, because another one of my favourite models that I love to use is appreciative inquiry. I've always I know it works best when you're looking to problem solve and you're looking to strengths rather than problems. And there's a really great webinar on there about that one as well.
What advice would you give to someone who's considering starting a career in organisation development? So maybe they're in HR, maybe they're in a slightly adjacent field, maybe they're just looking in at OD, or maybe they're just at the very beginning. What kind of advice would you give someone to sort of ease that learning curve along the way?
Talk to people, because I think what really helped me when I first started was doing that Roffey Park course very early on in my career, because what it was able to do was one of the first activities I think you do is you look at the different definitions. You soon realize there isn't one, and so you let go of it. And I think having that experience very early on is really helpful. I think if you if I'm going to talk from as if it was me, if I had started too academic, I think I would have felt overwhelmed and I would have felt a bit lost. And I'm not sure I would have even known what OD was. I was really lucky to have practitioners around me that I could ask and make sense of the field. So that would be my biggest bit of advice. Talk to people, gain your own understanding, really understand what it looks like. Like I say, my experience of OD, 1 minute I'm doing org design, the next I'm doing employee engagement and coming up with communication strategies, then I'm doing leadership development programs. I had a whole contract where I didn't do any of that, and I did continuous improvement for 18 months, and I still count that as org development. Would I have found that in the literature? Maybe if I'd have read an article about the history of org development and it coming in the 80s, but I don't think I would find literature that said it was part of the field now. So I think talk to people and really formulate your own thinking and not be too attached to whether you're doing it or not. You can tell I'm still talking to my younger self, can't you?
It's a good conversation. We enjoy listening to it.
But yeah.
Brilliant. Well, it's been so great talking to you. For someone who's got significant jet lag, you've answered all of our 42 questions perfectly, with no passes as well. It's been really good. And exactly what we said at the beginning. It's been a really refreshing take on organisation development, and also really good for making it accessible, because we fundamentally believe that if more people adopted an organisation development approach through their practice and through their work, regardless of whether you are an OD practitioner or not, it would make the biggest difference to organisations as well. So thank you for sharing all of those tips and all those insights as well. Danny, I've got 3 takeaways. I've got about 10, but I'm going to narrow it down to 3. So I've got the importance of continually contracting is one of the things that sort of stands out from this conversation. It's just, it's doing it at the beginning, but it's continually doing it throughout. The importance of it depends and not being too attached and having certainty and trying to sort of sell a solution to people is actually it's working with them. And something that's going to keep me awake all night tonight is trying to imagine a world without models. It's just blown my mind. I can't even think about it. So I'm going to think about this about 3 a.m. So thank you. What have you got, Danny?
I think for me, the 3 things are probably the importance of meeting people where they are, and when you said about standing shoulder to shoulder with people, I think that's so important. I think you said right at the beginning about asking courageous questions and not being afraid to kind of prod and nudge a little bit and just ask, are you sure? That's so important. And then I think the last thing you said about talking to people and using your network, and I think the field of OD's got some really generous people who are willing to share their knowledge and their experience, so really drawing on that.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate your time. For those of you watching, Sarah joins an incredible library that we're building, talking to practitioners, doing really meaningful, significant change in their organisation. So hopefully this has earned your like. And if you want to keep up to date with all the latest interviews that we've got coming up, please subscribe to the channel, and please tell other OD practitioners or HR professionals about the channel as well, because the more we can sort of share the amazing insight that Sarah and people like her have earned from the front line, the better. So thank you so much, Sarah. You're very welcome to go back to bed now.
Yeah.
So
thank you very much. Thank you for your time. It's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.